Today I'm reacting to a conversation from the Muslim Lantern titled Confident Atheists Put to the Test by Muslim for Blindly Accepting Evolution. At first glance, the discussion appears to be about evolution, but after listening carefully, I don't think evolution is the real issue at all. The real question is much deeper. If Allah truly wanted all of humanity to know that Muhammad was his prophet, why would he choose such a remarkably weak communication strategy? The conversation begins with Muhammad Ali speaking to a passerby who says he no longer believes in God and accepts evolution. Muhammad Ali immediately challenges him, arguing that most people accept evolution without actually studying it. He shifts the discussion to abiogenesis, the origin of life, and asks how the first living cell came into existence. When the passerby cannot answer, Muhammad Ali argues that science cannot explain the transition from chemistry to biology, and therefore naturalism is deeply problematic. He then presents a cosmological argument, saying the universe itself requires an intelligent creator because matter, energy, and the laws of physics need an explanation. From there, he broadens his criticism of evolution. He argues that the fossil record is actually evidence against evolution, discusses Lucy, vestigial organs, Darwin's concerns about gradualism, and the Cambrian explosion. He even says that whale pelvic bones are not vestigial because they serve a reproductive purpose. Finally, after spending much of the conversation criticizing evolution, he makes what I believe is his real case for Islam. He argues that the Quran contains scientific knowledge that Muhammad could not have known naturally, that it contains fulfilled prophecies, that it accurately describes ancient history, and that Muhammad's life cannot be explained unless he truly was a messenger of God. His conclusion is that these pieces of evidence collectively prove that the Quran came from Allah. Now, I want to make something clear before I explain why I remain unconvinced. I don't think Muhammad Ali is stupid. I don't think he's insincere. In fact, I think he's one of the more articulate Muslim apologists online. He raises legitimate philosophical questions about why the universe exists and why there is something rather than nothing. Those are fascinating questions, but I think he ultimately asks me to accept something I cannot simply accept. My central thesis is this. Allah's communication strategy is far too weak for an all-powerful God. Notice that this has almost nothing to do with evolution. Suppose evolution were completely false. Suppose abiogenesis were never solved. Suppose the Big Bang required a creator. Would that establish Muhammad was Allah's prophet? Not even close. Muhammad Ali recognizes this himself because he eventually has to move away from evolution and begin defending the Quran. Evolution is not the destination, it's merely the first step. The real burden is establishing that Muhammad genuinely spoke on behalf of the creator of the universe. This is where I think Islam runs into its biggest problem. Imagine someone walking into your city tomorrow and said, God spoke to me. How would you verify that claim? If they handed you a book and said, the proof that I spoke to God is the book I wrote, and the book says that I spoke to God, would that independently authenticate their claim? Of course not. The evidence depends entirely on trusting the claimant. That is exactly what bothers me about Islam. Muhammad says he spoke to Allah. Muhammad delivers the Quran. The Quran tells us Muhammad spoke to Allah. And every generation after him is expected to infer that this chain is trustworthy. But where is Allah? Why is the creator of the universe silent while Muhammad does all the talking? Muhammad Ali eventually asks the atheist a question that I actually think is the most important question in the entire discussion. What would convince you that a scripture is from God? My answer is remarkably simple: independent authentication. If Allah wants humanity to know Muhammad is his prophet, then Allah should authenticate Muhammad himself. Not through one private revelation in 7th century Arabia, not through verses that people continue debating 14 centuries later, not through scientific miracle claims that require reinterpretation, not through historical arguments that scholars continue disputing. Directly. If Allah appeared to humanity, demonstrated unmistakably that he exists, and identified Muhammad as his messenger, then the debate would be over. The real test could finally begin. And that's another point where I part ways with many religious people. I don't think the test should be whether I can correctly identify God from ambiguous evidence. The test should be, what do I do after I know God exists? Will I obey? Will I be compassionate? Will I tell the truth? Will I sacrifice my own interests to do what is right? Those are meaningful moral tests. Trying to determine whether one particular ancient book among thousands really came from God is a completely different exercise. Some people respond by saying, If Allah revealed himself directly, there would be no test of faith. But why should belief itself be the test? Even within Islamic tradition, people who supposedly knew God existed still disobeyed him. Knowledge does not eliminate free choice. If anything, clear knowledge would make moral responsibility stronger, not weaker. This brings me to one concrete example from Muhammad Ali's discussion. He argues that whale pelvic bones are not vestigial because scientists discovered they are used during reproduction, implying that biology textbooks, and by extension, evolutionary theory, were fundamentally wrong. Here's the problem. Modern evolutionary biology does not define a vestigial structure as something completely useless. A vestigial structure is one that has lost its original ancestral function, even if it later acquires another one. Whale ancestors used pelvic bones to support hind limbs for walking on land. Modern whales no longer use them for locomotion, but the reduced bones still anchor muscles involved in reproduction. Discovering that reproductive function did not overturn common ancestry. It refined scientists' understanding of those bones. And that's an important difference. Science changes when new evidence appears. That's one of its strengths. By contrast, what often happens in apologetics is that scientific understanding changes first, and then religious interpretations are updated afterward to fit the latest discoveries. The direction of travel is frequently from science to reinterpretation, not from scripture to scientific discovery. But even if Muhammad Ali were completely right about pelvic bones, even if he were completely right about every criticism of evolution, even if every scientific miracle claim in the Quran turned out to be correct, I would still be left asking the same question. Why would an all-powerful God rely on evidence that remains debatable after 14 centuries? If Allah truly wanted every human being to know that the Quran came from him, why communicate through one man in one place at one time? Why not reveal himself to every generation? Why not speak? Why stop speaking after Muhammad died? Why leave billions of people to argue over Arabic grammar, ancient manuscripts, historical context, and competing interpretations? Humans can live stream to billions of people today. Surely the creator of the universe is capable of a communication strategy better than parchment carried across continents over many centuries. That is why I remain unconvinced. It's not because I hate religion. It's not because I blindly trust science. It's not because I think evolution explains everything. It's because the God described in Islam is infinitely powerful, infinitely knowledgeable, and deeply concerned with humanity's eternal destiny. Yet the evidence he supposedly chose looks remarkably ordinary. For me, that's the deepest tension in Islam. Not evolution, not fossils, not embryology, but the surprisingly human way in which an all-powerful God allegedly chose to communicate with the world.